Welcome to CLIBURN Masterpiece. I'm Buddy Bray. I'm your host for Masterpiece, and we come to you from the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. In CLIBURN Masterpiece, we take a look at some of the greatest works ever written for the piano, both new and old. We talk to some of the best pianists in our CLIBURN family, and also composers and other professionals in the field of music as well. On this episode of CLIBURN Masterpiece, a piano work written in 1976 that has entered the standard repertoire of pianists all over the world. Can't say that about many pieces. It is the Etude Fantasy by John Corigliano. Corigliano has long been a member of our CLIBURN family. He wrote the commissioned work for the 1985 CLIBURN, and of course he's gone on to win Oscars and Grammys. We'll talk to John about his 1976 work for piano, Etude Fantasy. We'll hear it played by another treasured member of our CLIBURN family, pianist Elizabeth Joy Roe. Here is our conversation with Liz and with John Corigliano. I wonder if we could start by your telling us what your relationship to the piano has always been. When did the piano come into your life?
Well, actually, my mother was a fine pianist and piano teacher. And as you know, my father was a violinist. My mother never played in public, but she actually had a big technique and she was very musical. And she taught piano. And the problem was that I used to play by ear, and then I had 2 lessons with my mother. We had a huge fight, and I never studied the piano again. So although my hands on the piano feel good and I can do things, I can't even I wouldn't know how to finger an A flat major scale, for example. I wouldn't know where to put my first finger. So I can't play the scales, but I can write them, of course. But I can play what my hands tell me. And from what I've been told, my work is pianistic.
I want to talk about starting a work like Etude Fantasy. How did that begin? Was it your idea? Was it someone else's? Was it a commission? How did that start?
Well, it was a commission. There was a commission in the Bicentennial year, 1976. The Kennedy Center commissioned, I believe, 10 pianists, and each one was to choose a composer who would write a piece for him or her. And James Tocco was one of the pianists, and he asked me to write the piece. So I had a commission to write a major work, but of course, no instructions on what to do. It could be anything at all. And I started thinking about it. And I remember Jimmy playing, I believe Moskowski, I'm not sure, an etude for the left hand. And it always puzzled me, not being a pianist and having my right hand therefore more facile, why the left hand was the preferred hand for concertos and solo pieces and not the right, because my right is more agile. So I decided to write an etude in which I would myself learn through the etude why the left hand is better, and indeed it is better.
I want to take you back to when you first heard the piece. Do you remember who played it? Was it a recording? Do you remember anything about that?
So I would like to credit my teacher at the time, Veda Kaplinsky, who suggested that I learn it. And so, you know, as one is wont to do when you're in conservatory, this was, I was at Juilliard at the time. I just sought out a recording. We didn't have Spotify back in those days, so probably went to the Juilliard Library or Tower Records across the street. And there is a seminal recording performed by James Tocco, who is the dedicatee of the work. And I just thought it was the coolest thing that I had heard, especially again, going back to that opening. There's something so colossal about those booming low notes and the fact that it kind of traverses the entire range of the keyboard pretty immediately. So I remember being just absolutely captivated And then, just in exploring the piece myself, it was such a joy and a challenge to kind of explore Corigliano's amazing sort of pianistic inventions and the combination of virtuosity with this kind of interior expressivity, or this through line that kind of, it takes it beyond mere sort of technical display.
So I wrote this etude, but I knew I was going to write a bigger piece. I wanted to write a kind of fantasy. And here I was writing an etude. And I said to myself, what would happen if I took the materials from this etude, and then I wrote several other etudes in the form of a fantasy? And that's where Etude Fantasy began.
I want to talk actually for a minute about how you see the whole piece, the whole 20-minute journey of Etude Fantasy, and how much thought you have to put into that. It's not just mastering the notes and getting through the first etude and then the third etude and then the one with the ornaments, which is the one which has all of those notes, just gets so black with notes on the page in the fourth etude. But also you have to be thinking about the work as a whole. John Corigliano is one of the most dramatic of all composers. The theatrical element in his music is very, very important. So how did you approach that side of things in the piece?
Yeah, so I like to think that the piece as a whole almost has an arch form, if you will. So it's sort of like there are 5 etudes that run seamlessly into each other. And they're related by these motivic elements, and he manipulates them and transforms the themes. But the third etude, that's Fist the Thirds, that sort of brings in a new sort of theme. But so that one to me kind of stands on its own. It seems central in the sense that it is very contrasting to the outer etudes. You have, because the other ones 1 and 4 are extremely intense, they're dynamic, they're dramatic, and then 2 and 5 have this quiet intensity, but not as overtly virtuosic, but still tests the skills of the pianist. Whereas Fist the Thirds, it almost seems like this fluttery, like scherzo-like episode amidst all of those contrasts. And then sort of furthermore, I always like to think about, like, what is the ultimate climax in a piece of music? And of course that happens in my favorite movement of all, and that's number 4, which is called Ornaments. And it's filled with all of these trills, tremolandi, roulades, kind of these, the most showy, if you will, kind of configurations. And this is where, it sort of reaches the emotional and technical apex. Like right at the end of it, he's like at the top of the keyboard, and it's like various themes kind of piled on top of each other. And in the moment when you're watching the piece unfold, it really does crescendo to that moment. So it's incredibly exciting. It sort of is an apotheosis of the entire piece, encapsulated in sort of that climax. So in thinking about that, every moment sort of leading to that climax, it's sort of like a magnet, it's kind of inexorably pulling the pianist and the audience, even if there's sort of mini kind of peaks on the way. It's sort of all about that moment. And I think that that's one of the things that, again, makes this piece so powerful. And again, harkens to, I don't know if John mentioned this, but the idea that this is sort of in the spirit of American romanticism, that there's, it makes you think of like Samuel Barber's climaxes in his concertos, or in like the Barber Fugue, that there's kind of this inexorable pull to this moment that no one can deny is the crux of the piece.
Did you start with Etude Fantasy, or was there a certain point where you saw the whole structure in your head?
Well, around that time, about 1975, was the first time I started architecting my music. And this is 76, so it's brand new into this. So actually, the first etude was written without knowing what was coming next. But then after that, I wanted to plan an arch, because I like to actually almost draw out an emotional curve of how the pieces go. And then what returns, what develops, what is new material, how you approach climaxes, how you approach lyrical passages. In fact, everything about the music, you try to plan ahead of time, just like a sculptor would plan a body inside a piece of marble before he sculpts a finger, or an architect would know the whole building before he lays a couple of bricks down and says, I wonder what this is. See, that's the kind of thinking I used to do many years ago. And now I architect the piece, and then I find the music that fits the piece.
First 6 notes, how did you, so you have a blank piece of score paper staring back at you. How does one come up with this? I cheated, I used both hands, of course, but
Exactly.
how?
I used one hand, first of all. When I wrote this movement, I only used my left hand because that was fair. I wanted to start with a low note and then angularly work myself up to a high note that is a black key, so that I could put my thumb on it and repeat it and take my 4th and 5th fingers and hit a third way below that, say a 5th below that, a third, and then switch from the 1st finger to the 5th finger, continuing to hit that, turns out an E flat, and then hit a third way above, and then come back and switch, so that I could then move up and down the piano while repeating this note. So it had to be a black key, because if you try it with a right key, it's very cumbersome. Again, my hand led me. I said, let your hand lead you into what the left hand can do. You've got to learn this.
I've got a couple of very specific questions. One is the very dramatic opening that you alluded to just now, with those first 6 notes that John talked to us about exactly why he chose those pitches and so forth. But what I want to ask you is, because we get a lot of questions about this, and they're good questions, what is it like to play with just your left hand? This first etude is for the left hand alone. It's not the only one ever written, but it's very, very dramatic. And what is that like? What does that feel like to play with your left hand alone?
It's actually a very empowering feeling, which might sound ironic, because traditionally or anecdotally, the left hand is supposed to be the lesser, the weaker hand, in foreign languages, like in French, la main gauche, so it sort of implies that the left hand somehow doesn't have the same prowess as the right hand, which I obviously disagree with. I am right-handed though, so certainly I have sort of dominance in my right hand, but what's so great about it is that, especially if the audience has no idea what to expect. I mean, it is called For the Left Hand Alone, but if the audience just sees Etude Fantasy, doesn't know what the individual etudes are called, I think it is such a striking visual to see the pianist go out there, literally. And you think it's just temporary, but then it lasts for about 6 minutes. And to be sure, certainly it is very difficult, because you're not balanced quite right. And there's a lot, when you're playing low with the keyboard, obviously that's sort of more oriented to the physical kind of comfort of playing with the left hand, but he does write material that's like all the way up there. And so it's this constant kind of, as we were saying, a tightrope act physically to be able to execute all of the configurations.
it's so interesting that something physical would generate so much of the piece, because the intervals are very important also that you came up with in those first 6 notes. This interval is very important because it can also be that. So
Yes.
minor seconds also become very important.
Full of that. But of course, once I got that in my brain, that was the material, then every etude took on the shape of that material. And I used both hands, of course, for the other ones. But of course, played it very, very slowly, knowing that a real pianist could play it very, very fast.
The third etudes, fifths, 2/3, is the point in the piece where the harmony sort of changes. The sun comes out a little bit. We're sort of really in the key of G.
Said, yeah, that central etude, he messes around with, like, I think Mixolydian and Lydian modes, which makes it stand out. Yeah, as opposed to, the other movements are so much more informed by this idea of the 7th, the 9th, the 2nd, kind of those permutations. And then, he does also, it's ironic because the fifths and thirds, they actually are also seminal throughout the piece too. But yeah, it does have a brightness that the other parts, the other parts feel somber, they feel sort of weighty, and this one feels kind of like it can take flight.
So Liz, there are 2 etudes in Etude Fantasy that are not maybe so much about outward virtuosity. And they are the etudes about legato and then the etude about melody. Can you tell us a little bit about why these present particular challenges as well?
I do think their inclusion heightens the impact of the piece because, again, it brings out the contrasts in sort of a macro sense. When you pare it down to something, there are like literally single notes over this ostinato. It doesn't seem like it should be challenging, and yet what makes it challenging is keeping everything. So I'm talking about etude number 2. Everything needs to feel almost as still as, the glassy surface of, a pond that is just, it's there. Also, personally, I love the transition between the end of the first etude going in, because as we were talking about, in terms of the left hand having its moment in the sun, and you have no idea when the right hand's going to emerge. There's something so cool. You have this ostinato going. So at the top, it's not that difficult, but then these sort of inner voices come in, and it's this kind of counterpoint, and everything needs to feel very graduated, very controlled. That's the technical challenge of that one. And then the other slow, less overtly virtuosic etude is the final one, which is called Melody. Again, very simple title, but the ultimate goal, I think, with anything virtuosic, if it's written this way, some etudes are just merely percussive and motoric, and melody might not be of such kind of import, but it's amid this, again, another ostinato, and there's this kind of yearning. Then switches to the left hand, so there's kind of the sharing, overlapping of the melody between the hands, while there's still, again, the filigree of various motives coming in to add some texture, some interest, but through it all, there's this very human voice that's at the crux of that movement, that is sort of the glue. I would almost say this is when the humanness of the piece really comes through. This is why I also think it's such an effective close to the piece, because you could almost look at the earlier stuff, this feels almost kind of computerized, digitized, and the ornaments, there's something colossal, almost like nature, storms, and something volcanic, and even like earth shattering, like a quake. There's something elemental about that one. And then the last one is sort of where you have this, this lone individual human yearning, searching kind of voice. And so that's where the like romanticism kind of seeps in.
In that last etude, I think when you played a little bit of it, it's like we feel the full weight of what has happened for the previous 17 minutes.
Yeah.
And then it's sort of like the theme coming back at the end of the Goldberg variations. We've had sort of a journey, and then we get that theme again that we had in the beginning of Etude Fantasy, but it's different now. We've been on a journey. Why do you think people are so drawn to it? What drew you to it?
I think the piece has this immediate dynamism and visceral quality. It's something that on an intellectual and pianistic level is incredibly intriguing, and has so many compelling elements that make it just such a pleasure to play. But also, I think on the listening level for an audience, it's such a striking piece. There are all of these contrasts, and it covers a breadth of expression and emotion. And it's just one of those pieces that sort of grabs you from the opening moments. And I do think also Corigliano's mastery of playing with these genres of etudes and fantasia, if you will, the fantasia form combined with the virtuosity of etudes. He manipulates these forms with such adroitness and imagination. And so I think it coalesces into a composition of just tremendous intensity, excitement, surprise, and it's just extremely effective in performance.
What about the drama of it? There's so much drama baked into a lot of not only this piece, but pieces that came right after this. For instance, like the clarinet concerto, there's a lot of drama baked into that. Does that come from your desire to connect with the audience, or is it something more than that?
It's my desire also to connect with me. I am a dramatic person. Anyone who lives with me knows that. I'm a dramatic guy, and my music is dramatic because it's part of my life. I lived in a dramatic world with my father playing all this and my mother doing this, and they were also separated and divorced and all sorts of other things, and lots of Italian Jewish screaming back and forth. And the whole idea of drama is infused into me. I love it. It's part of my life. I'll never be undramatic. So it's a natural thing. And if I'm to please myself, I have to give myself a piece that is dramatic for myself as well as for the audience. But the audience has to be lit in on this all.
How long did it take you to learn it?
How long it took for me to learn? That's a good question. This feels like ancient history to me because I was at conservatory. I think it probably took a few months. I was learning it in tandem with other pieces of music, but it became a piece that I loved performing from the moment that I kind of got it in my fingers. It was a piece that I've even after the competition, that I've performed on several occasions because it really spoke to me.
From the preliminary rounds of the 2005 edition of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition, here is pianist Elizabeth Joy Roe in the Etude Fantasy from 1975 of American composer John Corigliano. Our thanks to Elizabeth Joy Roe and composer John Corigliano for joining us for this episode of CLIBURN Masterpiece. As always, our thanks go out to the Kimball Art Museum for hosting us. I'm Buddy Bray. Thank you so much for watching CLIBURN Masterpiece.